June 1914. The air in Sarajevo hung heavy with dust and the scent of exhaust. Gavrilo Princip stood pressed against the brickwork of a street corner, his fingers locked around the cold, unyielding steel of a pistol inside his pocket. His hand shook. He forced his breathing to slow, watching the crowd thin as the motorcade approached. The lead vehicle rounded the bend. Then, the impossible happened. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The heavy car lurched to a halt in the center of the road, stalling directly in front of him. The silence that followed was absolute. Princip watched the driver struggle with the ignition. He saw the Archduke turn his head, confused by the sudden stop. The window of opportunity opened, narrow and jagged. Princip pulled his hand from his pocket. The metal caught the sunlight. He stepped off the curb, his boots hitting the cobblestones with a sharp, singular rhythm. He raised the weapon, leveled the barrel. The two shots shattered the morning, and the echo did not stop in Sarajevo. It traveled through telegraph wires and across borders, pulling the pins on a century of tension. Within hours, the alliance systems began to grind into motion. Germany mobilized its forces, the heavy iron of its artillery trains rolling toward the border. Russia answered, the Tsar ordering the call-up of millions, his ink still wet on the mobilization orders. Britain crossed the Channel, the gray hulls of its fleet cutting through the North Sea. It was a chain reaction of steel and paper. By August, the illusion of a localized conflict evaporated. Across the continent, train stations overflowed with men. They climbed into carriages, leaning out of windows to wave at crowds that cheered until their throats were raw. They shouted that they would be home by Christmas. They only heard the rhythm of their own boots hitting the pavement, a steady, thunderous beat that signaled the end of the old world. The rhythm of the march died in the mud of the Western Front. By late autumn, the open fields had become a graveyard of ambition. The soldiers stopped moving. They dropped their packs, grabbed entrenching tools, and began to claw at the earth. They dug until their knuckles bled, carving deep, jagged veins into the landscape. The soil was heavy, saturated with rain and rot. It clung to everything. It filled their boots, crusted their skin, and turned the simple act of standing into a struggle. The dream of a quick victory dissolved into the gray reality of the trench. Rats moved through the walls of the dugouts. Disease spread through the damp air, a silent, creeping presence. Every morning, the men looked out over the parapet to see a cratered wasteland. The horizon was no longer a line of movement, but a jagged edge of barbed wire and churned earth. They were inhabitants of a subterranean existence. The war had stopped moving. It had settled into the mud, waiting, breathing, and rotting in the dark. The silence of the stalemate was a lie. It lasted only until the artillery found its range. Then, the ground began to heave. Shells fell in rhythmic, crushing waves, turning the landscape into a churned, cratered wasteland where nothing could stand. The air grew thick with pulverized stone and the metallic tang of explosives. Men pressed their faces into the mud, waiting for the vibration to stop. But the barrages were relentless. They tore through the earth, erasing the lines of the trenches and burying the living in the debris. When the fire lifted, the order came down the line. Thousands of men climbed out, their boots slipping on the slick, broken earth. They moved forward, not with the speed of a charge, but with the heavy, exhausted gait of the doomed. They walked into the open. Machine guns opened up from the opposing ridge, stitching lines of fire across the mud. The men fell in rows, their bodies becoming part of the landscape. The line did not break. It only shifted, a few yards at a time, bought with the price of thousands. The pressure mounted, an endless, grinding weight. The air in the trench turned cold before dawn. Men checked their weapons, fingers tracing the rough metal, eyes fixed on the wooden ladder leading up. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic thud of heavy guns. Then, the whistle cut through the damp air. It was sharp, thin, and final. The first wave surged upward. Boots scrambled against the mud. Hands clawed at the parapet, and bodies poured over the top. They entered the gray light of the open field. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of heavy breathing and the slap of feet on wet earth. Then, the machine guns began, a low, mechanical rattle that quickly rose to a constant tearing roar. The air filled with lead. Men stopped mid-stride, spun, and collapsed into the craters. The second wave followed, then the third, moving into the storm. There was no cover, there was no retreat. The ground became a churned mass of earth and broken movement. Within minutes, the field was silent again, save for the wind and the distant, uncaring thunder of the artillery. The carnage was absolute. While the trenches held the West in a death grip, the East began to tear itself apart from within. The Russian Empire, strained by the relentless demands of total war, reached its breaking point. In the freezing streets of Petrograd, the bread lines grew longer, then angrier. Women and workers stood in the snow. The police arrived, then the army, but the order to fire was met with silence. Soldiers lowered their rifles. The authority of the Tsar evaporated in a single afternoon. He stood isolated in his palace. With a stroke of a pen, the monarchy ended, leaving a vacuum that the Bolsheviks moved to fill with ruthless speed. Red banners replaced the imperial crests. The old world, built on centuries of tradition, fractured. The era of empires was burning, and from the ashes, a new volatile order began to take shape. By 1917, the Western Front was a graveyard of ambition. The armies were hollowed out, their ranks thinned by years of attrition. Then, the horizon changed. Ships arrived in French ports, not with hundreds, but with thousands of men. They stepped onto the docks with clean gear and steady hands, a stark contrast to the mud-caked veterans they replaced. The United States had entered the fray. They brought more than just soldiers. They brought the full, unyielding weight of industrial might. Trains groaned under the strain of shells, rifles, and supplies. The Allies, once gasping for air, suddenly found a new, relentless rhythm. The German command watched their reserves vanish as the fresh American divisions pushed into the lines. It was a tide that could not be held back. Artillery fire intensified, no longer sporadic, but a constant, rolling thunder that pulverized the German defenses. Every trench, every bunker, every hidden machine gun nest was targeted with surgical, overwhelming force. The exhausted German army began to buckle. The final offensive was not a battle of tactics, but a collision of sheer industrial scale. The stalemate was broken, and the war surged forward. The final hours were not defined by movement, but by a frantic, desperate intensity. Every shell fired was a last attempt to claim ground before the clock ran out. Then, the 11th hour arrived. On the 11th of November, 1918, the order reached the front lines. The artillery, which had roared for 4 years without respite, suddenly choked into silence. It was not a gradual fading. It was an abrupt, jarring cessation of sound. Soldiers crawled out of their dugouts, blinking in the pale light, unable to comprehend the quiet. They stood on the cratered lips of their trenches. The wind whistled through the jagged stumps of trees, a sound that had been drowned out by the constant thunder of war for years. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. It carried the weight of 20 million lives extinguished in the mud. There was no cheering, no immediate celebration. There was only the realization of the scale of the void. Men looked at their hands, at the empty spaces beside them, and at the horizon that no longer held the threat of incoming fire. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was a hollow, echoing reminder of the staggering cost of the conflict. The silence did not last. It was merely the pause before the world began to dismantle itself. Across the continent, the old order crumbled into dust. The empires that had stood as pillars of the previous century, the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, and the German fractured from within. Their borders, once etched in stone and history, were erased by the stroke of a pen and the shifting of power. New nations emerged from the ruins, tentative and fragile, claiming sovereignty over landscapes still littered with the debris of the front lines. Diplomats gathered in gilded rooms to redraw the map, but their ink could not cover the deep, jagged fissures left by the conflict. They carved lines through territories, ignoring the complex history of the people who lived there. These new boundaries were not solutions. They were volatile, unstable seams. The seeds of future conflicts were sown into the very soil that had been churned by artillery. Every treaty signed and every border shifted carried the weight of unresolved grievances. The 20th century would be defined by these scars. They were not merely historical footnotes, but living, breathing tensions that would dictate the course of the decades to come. The Great War had ended, yet its reach extended far beyond the armistice. The war was over, but the century it had broken was only just beginning.